Just to clarify, this is not a story from Let's Read himself. This story was submitted by a subscriber who created their own YouTube channel. I started narrating stories on YouTube because after sending every story I wrote to all the big names and a few lesser-known names, I got no response. No thanks for sending, no your story sucks, nothing. Now I won't mention who they are, but most of you should know who I'm talking about. Although one big name did read a short story of mine, which I'm very thankful for, and it wasn't my best. And this went on for a while. After months of frustration, I finally realized that it wasn't going to happen, so I decided to narrate my own stories, create a YouTube channel, pick a name, and then post them myself. How hard could it be? And so I did. My stories were good, at least I thought so. And to my surprise, a few people actually liked them, and after a while, asked if I would narrate their stories. Wow, really? Okay, I thought. They would send them to me via email, which I gave them, and I would narrate their stories. And that started the ball rolling. I was talking to a coworker one day about narrating stories for fun, and they suggested that I check out an app called Reddit and search short scary stories and no sleep. They said they posted a few stories on there and thought that it would be perfect for me, so I did. I created an account and started my search, and there I found all kinds of amazing stories. I contacted some authors through comments and personal messages, asking permission to read their stories. Most were cool with it, and although I did get a few rejections, I just kept on asking. And always ask permission, by the way. Things were going great. I was narrating amazing stories, and people were liking them, and I even earned enough karma on Reddit to start my own community. I decided to use it for people to send stories to, and people actually did. All the while, I still searched other communities for stories to read. That was until I found that story. I should have known by their username that it wasn't a good idea. I'm not going to mention the name of it because it still sends chills up my spine just thinking about it. And I'm shaking as I write this, believe it or not. It was around 1 a.m. Insomnia set in, and I was sitting at my dining room table searching Reddit. When I found that story, it blew me away. It had it all. Drama, suspense, emotion, everything. And I contacted the author through personal messaging asking permission, except for some reason I signed in using my real name, not my stage name. Big mistake. I realized what I did, but it was too late. I had already sent it. Anyway, mere seconds went by and I actually received a reply. Yes, I've been waiting for this, they said. Thinking they'd been waiting for someone to read one of their stories, just like I was, I replied, "Thank you," and planned to go on with my night. Until I received my own personal message from the author. "Hi, my name's Susan. Want to talk?" I figured, what the hell? I'm not doing anything else. What could it hurt? So I sent back, "Sure." After about a 30-minute conversation, I found out that 1, the author was female, 2, we both like Stephen King, 3, we both like horror movies, and 4, we both lived in the United States, only a few states away from each other. I started getting tired, and I let her know, and we ended the conversation, both saying goodnight. I was lying in bed, almost asleep, when I got a message from her saying, "I'm glad to have someone like you to talk to. I missed that." I shrugged it off and went to sleep. A couple of days went by and I came home from work and found a note on my door. It said, "Hi, sorry I missed you. Love, Susan." What? Love? I only talked to her for like half an hour. How'd she get my address? What did I just get myself into? I took the note off the door and quickly went inside, locking the door and calling the police. I told them the story, and they said that there was nothing they could do until an actual crime was committed. Wow, very reassuring. I hung up from them and tried to do my normal routine. Make coffee, get changed, drink coffee, and so on and so forth. I couldn't get that note out of my head. The doorbell rang. I froze and slowly walked to the window to see who it was. It was a woman. She was about 5.5 feet tall, tattered, dirty clothes, long, stringy brown hair. It looked like she hadn't bathed in a month. And I immediately knew it was Susan. I had to end this quick, right now, before it turned ugly, and ugly it turned. I opened the door and said, "Look, Susan, I don't know what you think's going on, but I just wanted to read your story. That's it. I'm sorry if you thought there was something more, but there's not. Just go home." I shut the door and walked back into the house. She screamed like a wild woman. She started pounding on the door, screaming, "I love you! I love you!" I immediately ran to the phone to call 911. A rock or brick or something came crashing through the front window. I turned and saw that crazy woman climbing into my house, screaming, "Read my story! Read my story!" The shards of glass from the broken window cutting her as she climbed in, blood on the window and the floor. The dispatcher said, "911, what's your emergency?" And I barely had time to say anything before she charged, slamming into me, knocking me over the desk and falling to the floor herself. She was kicking and screaming like a lunatic. I got up, phone still in hand, and smashed it hard against her temple as she was getting up. See, I don't hit women, but this woman deserved it. Her eyes rolled into the back of her head and the screaming stopped and she fell to the floor unconscious. I heard sirens outside. I guess the 911 operator heard it all. The cops came, took my statement, and they made me stay outside while the paramedics tended to Susan, if that even was her real name. The cops put her in cuffs and the paramedics took her to the ambulance. On her way out, she looked at me, laughing, and they put her inside and left. The cops finished up and did the same. I was left with a messed up door, a broken window, blood all over the place, a broken desk, and a broken phone. All over one story. And I was done. I moved out that night. I left all my stuff behind. I slept in my car till payday, then rented a room off a coworker. And I never narrated another story again. So, if any of my subscribers are reading this and wondered whatever happened to me, now you know. This is why I stopped narrating stories on YouTube.
This happened to me over 30 years ago, but I remember the feeling of fear as if it were yesterday. I was in college, a female, taking a course on outdoor survival. The course ended with a 3-day, 3-night wilderness solo. We were allowed to take a backpack, empty canteen, sleeping bag, knife, 6 matches, a rope, a plastic sheet, a change of clothes, extra socks, tablets, small cooking pot and spoon, and that's about it. We were not allowed to bring food or water since part of our training was identifying edibles and finding a water source. Once I was dropped off, I had to hike to find a spot to set up to camp. First, I had to place a flag on a tree near my drop-off point so that I could be located 3 days later for pickup. I was loving life. It was just me and nature. I had zero fear, even as nightfall began. I enjoyed the sounds of the woods all around me and didn't mind not having a tent. I built a small fire and had a great feeling of peace. I slept well that night, but woke up thirsty. My search for a water source began. Happily, I found a muddy stream. I let the water settle in my pot, placed the tablets in the water, and boiled it for good measure. Yuck. Not a great taste, but at least I was hydrated. All went well, and I had a great time until my last day. It was early afternoon on the last day and time to break camp. I cleaned up my camp area and hiked out to my drop-off spot. As I sat leaning up against a tree, I heard the sound of a vehicle off in the distance. I figured it had to be my pickup. As I waited, a vehicle that I'd never seen before pulled up into the dirt path in front of me. Immediately, I realized that I did not know the man who was driving. He gave me this really odd look. My gut told me that he was bad news. He asked what I was doing there and if I was alone. I said that my friends were behind me breaking camp. He gave me this knowing look, got back in his vehicle, and rode off. I was completely terrified. I knew I had to hide, and fast. I ran into the woods and hid. As I ran, I heard that same car come back. I stayed as quiet as I could and remained hidden. I heard him get out of the car. I could hear him calling to me, walking through the brush looking for me. I was so afraid. Eventually, he gave up. I heard the car door slam and the engine start and the car pull away. Going back to my drop-off point was now not an option, so I began hiking through the woods, hoping I would find base camp. After walking for what felt like hours, I found a forest ranger. I told him who I was and what happened to me. He told me that I'd done the right thing since a young woman had been raped the night before, and the police and Forest Service had been searching the area for this man. Happily, he drove me to the base camp, where I learned that another girl in my class had had a creepy encounter with the man the night before. She had scared him away by blowing a brass whistle until help arrived. If there's anything to learn from this, it's always to trust your gut. And I never camped alone again.
I grew up in the Chicago suburb of Skokie, which is about 10 to 11 miles north of downtown Chicago. I had a pretty regular, uneventful childhood. Almost everything before the age of 11 is a blur of just happy memories. I wasn't bullied in school. I never broke any bones falling off my bike. I was just kind of ignorant, a happy-go-lucky preteen boy with not so much as a care in the world. That all changed one Saturday after a visit to my grandma Pearl's house. I remember I was almost at the end of 5th grade, and we went to my grandma's house one Saturday for dinner. I loved my grandma Pearl, but my God, were her trips to her place boring for me. My mom and dad forbade me from ever bringing along my Game Boy as they thought that it would be rude, but then they also didn't seem to notice when I inevitably wandered off to try and keep myself entertained. Normally, I'd just wander off, explore her house, and wait until dinner was ready, but on this particular Saturday, I was feeling hungry. I went and asked Grandma how much longer dinner would be and felt my heart sink when I heard her say, "Not for at least another hour, sweetie." I walked into the kitchen, out of sight from my parents and Grandma, and then peered into the little oven window to see what we were having. I think it was some type of brisket or some other kind of roast. I just remember seeing it sizzling away and wanting to speed up the process. So, dumb 11-year-old me decides to crank up the heat. I wasn't so dumb that I cranked up the dial and then walked away. I stayed put in the kitchen, keeping an eye on the meat as it got browner and browner. Eventually, I started to smell a slight burning, but it still smelled okay, and the meat hadn't gotten black or anything, so I just went back to what I was doing, then figured I'd just check back in a few minutes. I don't know if something occupied my attention a little too long or if the temperature of the meat was suddenly such that it burst into flames, but the next thing I remember, I could see black smoke coming out of the oven, so I panicked. I ran into the living room, told my grandma that something was burning, so she got up and followed me into the kitchen. I ran up to the oven, pointed at the black smoke, and watched my grandma's expression suddenly and drastically change. I knew I was going to be in trouble if they found out that I ruined dinner, but the way my grandma started acting really scared me. I'd never seen her look so, I don't know, not mad, but horrified. And because I don't know what she was feeling, I assumed the worst and thought that my sweet old grandma was about to explode on me. Only she didn't, and I can barely even describe the feelings of fear and confusion I felt when she suddenly laid down on the kitchen floor and curled up into a ball. I remember how her eyes were wide, staring off at nothing as she sort of whispered something that I couldn't hear. There were only a few moments of that confusion before my parents appeared in the kitchen, my dad stepping over my grandma to deal with the burnt meat situation, while my mom kneeled next to Grandma asking, Mom, are you okay?" I had no idea what was happening. I just knew that I'd somehow caused it all by burning dinner, and I felt god-awful about it. Dad drove me back home. He was irate with me, but I was pretty angry at myself, too. All I wanted was to eat dinner a little easier, and now I'd be lucky if I got a PB&J after being banished to my room for giving my grandma a heart attack. That's honestly what I thought it was at first. And even when my dad said it wasn't a heart attack, I still had this terrible feeling that something equally awful had happened, something that was all my fault. My dad stayed home after I went up to my room and lay under my covers just crying, while my mom stayed with my grandma to make sure that she was okay. She returned home later that night, by which point it was way past my bedtime, but even so, they wake me up, sit on my bed, and have a little talk with me. I won't tell you everything they said to me, or this would take hours to write up, but the long and short of it was, my grandma had lived through World War II. My parents gave me a full history lesson right there in bed and explained why the smell of burning meat had upset my grandma so much. I remember being absolutely gripped with horror the entire way through. I couldn't believe that people could be so evil to each other over something so small and arbitrary. And it killed me to think that my own selfishness had brought back such horrific memories from my grandma, who had escaped a place called Sobibor in the 1940s. She moved to America when the war was over, met my grandpa, and the rest is history. I guess my mom and dad thought the best thing to do was to just be honest with me, having probably realized that my fear of the unknown would hurt worse than the dark truth. I suppose in hindsight it was the best thing to do, but it still messed with my head so bad that I barely slept a wink that night. I called my grandma the next day to apologize for scaring her, and told her that my parents had explained all that she'd been through. She obviously didn't want me to know, and I guess my mom and dad were complicit in shielding me from that ugly truth. I suppose it's like a lot of things with kids. You want to keep them as innocent as possible until absolutely necessary, then just hope they're equipped to deal with it. Truth be told, I didn't even know I was Jewish, or at least had Jewish ancestry. My mom didn't practice her religion, and her parents didn't mind if she married someone who didn't either. It wasn't like she was ashamed of her heritage or anything, she just learned that a lot of Jewish holidays brought back awful memories for my grandma, so our place became a kind of safe space for her. I'm not a religious person myself, none of that really interests me, but just like my mom, I still have a reverence for those that came before, or as my grandma called them, the survivors. This was in the mid-2000s when I was in about 2nd or 3rd grade. I lived in the rural Midwest and went to a decent-sized elementary school. For a few weeks, a friend of mine I chatted with often was absent from school. I was confused and curious as to why he hadn't been attending school for so many days. And soon I found out from the other kids in the school that he was taking time to rest and recover after a very traumatic experience in his family. I'm not going to reveal names as, for one, I don't remember the boy's name, and I don't want to reveal any personal info about those names that I do remember. And for the sake of easier reading, I'll call the boy who was absent Mike. The standard chats and occasional gossip I'd shared with friends on the playground and in the cafeteria took a very dark turn once word got out of why Mike was absent. You see, one day, a friend of mine, we'll call him Chad, told us that Mike's mother was murdered. Hearing later from some of the school employees, my own parents, I found out that this horrific act was carried out by the boyfriend of Mike's sister. The killer had snuck into the bedroom of his girlfriend's mother. He then either stabbed her to death or slit her throat in her sleep. I don't remember the exact details. I was only around 9 or 10 years old, so hearing this was especially shocking. Having something like that happen so close to me, even more so. I'm not quite sure how reliable this is, but according to Chad, the mother didn't want her daughter's relationship to get intimate until she and her boyfriend were married. She also didn't want them to get married until they had been together for a few years and she had gotten to know the guy well enough to know that he would treat her daughter well. The sister's boyfriend was furious at this and believed that the best way to get what he wants would be to eliminate what he saw as a roadblock. I was disgusted and disturbed at such a selfish, pathetic, and creepy move. This so-called man murdered an innocent woman just because he wanted to get intimate with her daughter and was delusional enough to believe that she would go along with him after he carried out the gruesome act. I remember one day on the way back home from school, my mom pointed out that the funeral procession was happening around the neighborhood we lived in. It honestly surprised me that it was that close to where we live. I remember seeing Mike in his black suit and tie with a very somber and serious look on his face. At school, I remember him being a pretty easygoing, cheerful guy who enjoyed cracking jokes with me. Seeing him like this hurt, and I can only imagine how this terror had affected him. Horror like this seems like it would stay with you, but honestly, I only just remember it, and there's still so many details that I don't quite recall. I don't even remember if Mike ever came back to school for the rest of the semester or not. If he did, I have no idea what I would have even said to him. What the hell do you even say to someone who had just had their life so cruelly changed at a young age? What do you say to someone whose mother was just taken from them by some heartless monster? Something about my memory of this being hazy unnerves me, and I wonder if being hit with this cold reality at such a young age influenced my often cynical outlook of the world. I hope Mike and his family are doing well, because no one deserves to have to go through that.
I live in a small country where things still go bump in the night, and that doesn't go for just creepy local legends. Dark strangers, cartels, I think you get the idea. Where I live, nowhere is truly removed from the day-to-day dangers of the unknown. It was a dark night. I found myself home alone. Here, it isn't uncommon for the entire family to live together. Grandparents, parents, children, grandchildren will all share a growing piece of property for wealth and security. It's the simplest way to live. But as you can imagine, being home alone is a rarity. With so many people under one roof, it's almost impossible to time anything just right to ever be actually alone. So I did what I always do. I hooked up the surround sound throughout the living room and turned out all the lights. I bundled up on the couch with my favorite snack and watched whatever I desired on the big family television. Despite the ever-present danger I mentioned earlier, I remember the evening being quite relaxing. Rain and a breeze moved in along the coast and created a pitter-patter against the roof. As the night went on, I thought I heard someone at the front door. As I moved to investigate, the sound and movement stopped. But being a stormy night, and that I had the sound up so loud, I truly in my heart believed I'd simply heard something that wasn't there. I turned back to the movie and did my best to relax. That's when the back door began to rattle. I adjust myself on the sofa to get a better look. When someone starts to knock, a frantic, heavy banging against the hard wood. I froze in place. Whatever I dismissed as storm sounds, or maybe just the junk blowing around in the backyard, is now undeniable. There's someone trying to come inside the house. Everyone who lives there naturally has a key. Whoever is outside the door clearly does not. At the time, I'm an 18-year-old man. I'm running through the logical scenarios in my head. Whoever this is, they tried to open up the front door, then slip around the side of the house, and is now trying to force the back door open. This isn't cartel or a monster. Anything with real bloodlust would have forced the front door open. I reasoned that it's a common thief, probably someone very nervous and trying to remain unseen. Being 18, I decided to take them head on and show the world this asshole picked the wrong house. I moved from the couch to the kitchen, grabbed the biggest cleaver I can find. 10 inches of dingy, ugly steel. Still, the door handle is twisting back and forth. Go time. I have no idea what's going to happen, but I'm down for whatever. There's nothing like the mentality of a teenager. "You don't know who you're messing with," I shouted through the door. The stranger on the other side stopped shaking the handle for a moment. "I know you're out there. You have 3 seconds to get the out of here, or I'll cut you up." They didn't care. The knocking started again, even harder than before. My confidence quickly faded. I took a deep breath and readied myself. In my head, this was do or die. Hoisting the cleaver over my head, I unfastened the bolt and threw open the door before me. It wasn't a burglar or a gangster of any kind. It was my sweet little grandma. She stood there soaking wet with an expression of agitation, but also unmistakable terror. "What are you doing?" she shouted at me. "Me? What are you doing at the back door?" I asked. "I thought you were an intruder." "No. She laughed as she stepped inside the house. I went and paused the television while she shed her coats by the door. She explained that she'd gotten home during the storm, tried knocking for a while. That was the noise I heard at the front door. I guess she knocked for quite a while because she finally gave up and decided to try the back door. The front entrance has a little cover, so she figured that even if it were locked, at least she would be out of the rain. That's when I started to hear the commotion and decided to go to war with whatever was outside. Glad I didn't though, because I seriously almost killed my grandma. I live in a pretty rural area outside of your average middle America town. It was my night off and I decided to just hang around the house myself. I got some things done around the yard, did a little self-care, and then settled in with dinner and a movie for the evening. I like to be low energy every now and again, but still I have the tendencies of a night owl. The movie turned into a TV show, and soon it was well past midnight. I hunkered down with my phone and a blanket and let the night really begin. Just as I'm zoning out, someone starts pounding on my front door. Not a knock, but a full force blow against the wood. I freeze for a moment, but then I make the easy assumption it's my boyfriend coming over for a spontaneous booty call. This was common behavior for him and one of the reasons I did like staying up late. I barely had to stand up from the couch to be able to see through the small glass window in the front door. Now, I really do freeze. My heart is the only thing I can feel in motion, steadily slamming up my throat. Staring back at me through the pain was not my boyfriend, but an older, bearded stranger. It was the most unfamiliar face I'd ever seen. This little window in the door was weird because if you were up close and trying to look through it, the prismatic glass skewed the optics, made it impossible to know what you were looking at. You had to have some distance between yourself and the window, like I had right now, to make out what was actually on the other side. This guy was looking at me, but I knew he couldn't actually see me. I snuck back down the hallway and hid in the doorway of my bedroom. I was scared, but I would have been way more scared if I didn't have an eye on him. I couldn't imagine how I'd feel if I turned my back for 1 second and lost track of him. Remember when I said I live rural? Well, I also live in a cellular dead zone. I didn't even bother to find the damn thing. Instead, I stepped to my bedside and fished the landline from my end table. I hit the dial button and brung the receiver to my ear. It's completely dead in my hand. The guy hammers on the door, this time screaming at the top of his lungs. "Let me in!" He slurs. My blood runs cold. This is now worse than a horror movie. I start running through what few options are available to me. No phone, no way to get to the car, no one coming to get me. I have to stay inside where it's safe. That's the only thing that makes sense. First, I sneak into the kitchen, slide the chef knife out of the block. It's the only weapon in the whole house. Next, I slink into the bathroom across from my bedroom and lock the door. It's just a weak little handle lock, but it's enough to buy me some time if he actually breaks through the front door. For some reason, the idea of keeping the high ground was pulsing through my mind. It was literally all I could think about, for I barricaded myself in the bathroom. So, I climbed up onto the countertop and crouched above the door. If he broke in, I'd be able to jump on his back and stab him in the neck and shoulders. I was terrified of the whole thing, but I do have to admit, I was very pleased with my whole little assault strategy. In my head, it made the most sense. With a knife in hand, all I had to do was sink it home. Time went by. That guy just keeps yelling, "Hey, let me in!" Now he was moving around the house. I could hear his hand dragging along the siding as he walked from end to end. He checked each and every window, yanking on the frame, pushing on the glass. Thankfully, I kept them all locked, as well as both doors. I could hear his frustration, and he took to wailing on the walls again, demanding I let him inside. Something occurred to me. That handset I fished out from my bedside table was dead. This psycho didn't cut the line. I just didn't charge the phone. There was a second one down the hall in the kitchen. Nervously, I climbed down from my perch on the countertop and waited until I heard the guy on the opposite side of the house. I unlocked the door and bolted for the phone, which was exactly where I thought it'd be, sitting in the cradle by the back door. I snagged it and retreated back to the bathroom. I called 911, and they dispatched a few officers, but were totally transparent when they told me it'd take at least 15 minutes for them to get there. I was on my own and needed to stay frosty until they arrived. I stayed on the line until the cops arrived. They could hear the guy pulling and kicking at the doors, screaming for me to open it. The longest 15 minutes of my life. When they arrived, they apprehended the man immediately. Dispatch confirmed that I could exit the house, where I stepped out to find a whole team of cops standing around one dirty, scruffy, drunk off his ass hippie-looking kid. He was cuffed, sitting on the ground, totally confused about the situation. He clearly wasn't a murderer. There was a party down the road. This kid stumbled off to take a piss or something, got lost in the dark, and thought my house was the spot. He convinced himself that everyone had locked the doors and was hiding somewhere. It turned out to be a big misunderstanding, but still, it was absolutely terrifying. To this day, nothing compares to what I felt that night. Remember to keep your phones charged and at the ready.
I live on my own in a 2-bedroom house. I used to rent out the spare room to tenants on a long-term basis, but when I heard about Airbnb, I learned that I could maximize the profits by charging more money for a short stay. Sometimes I could earn in a long weekend what I would receive for charging a month's rent, so it seemed like a no-brainer. This meant I either had the place to myself for a good portion of the month, or I was receiving a higher income for the month. Either way, it was a win. This one night, I received a booking from a new Airbnb user called Ella. When I say new, I mean her profile didn't have any feedback or anything indicating she had used the platform before. She had booked for 2 nights, and this was fine with me. Airbnb was pretty established at this point, and I would always take photos before and after to save arguments of damage. Plus, I had cameras installed in all the communal areas to protect me from damage or theft. The room I rented out was an ensuite bedroom and included a microwave and kettle in the room, so there was no real reason to leave unless you were leaving the house. Ella arrived, and at first glance she seemed nice, nothing unusual. We made some small talk, and she said she was just visiting some friends for the weekend and needed somewhere to crash. I showed her around and carried her bag up to her room and handed her her key and left her there. I usually just stayed in my room when people were over. The living room was off limits to guests, but usually when guests hear the television, they take it upon themselves to come in and chat, whereas people seem to respect the privacy of a bedroom a little more. That night I heard Ella walking around the house. She didn't make a lot of noise or anything, but I could hear the creaking of the floorboards as she tiptoed down the hall. I soon fell asleep as I had been working all week, and when I woke in the morning, everything seemed normal, nothing unusual about the house. I saw Ella leaving and wished her a good day. It was that night where things got really weird. I heard Ella come home and remember looking at the clock next to my bed. It was 1:15. I could hear 2 voices, Ella's and someone else's. I had explained the rules of no other guests in the house without asking me first, so I jumped out of bed to tell her there would be an additional charge for anyone else. I opened my bedroom door and there was Ella, standing on her own. I looked down the hall and there was no one there. Ella looked at me stunned as to why I had shot out of the bedroom door so fast. "I'm sorry, I thought I heard more than one voice," Ella replied. "It's okay, it happens all the time." I smiled and closed the door. What did she mean, it happens all the time? I thought this was an odd thing to say, and it kinda gave me chills. I was convinced she was talking to someone though, so I thought I would check the camera footage. The footage didn't record audio, as I thought that was a bit invasive, but as I watched the playback, Ella did appear to be talking to someone. She was smiling, laughing, and even looking to her side as if someone else was walking through the house with her, but as far as I could see, she was alone. Then I heard a loud thud, which sounded like it came from the hall, more specifically, outside my room. I felt a bit weirded out from watching that video of Ella walking through the house talking to someone, so I switched to the live feed. Ella's face was right in front of the hall camera. I shouted to her to ask if she was okay. She turned around and walked back into her bedroom without saying a word. I never saw her for the rest of the night. I didn't sleep for the rest of the night either. Sunday morning, I heard Ella's bedroom door close and heard her walking down the hallway, and then I heard the front door close. Most people thank you and say they had a nice time, but not Ella. She just left. Sunday night, still weirded out by the night before, I thought I would check out the cameras from Friday night too. Ella had been walking around the house for 3 hours in the middle of the night. But Ella didn't just walk around. She urinated in my kitchen sink, then went to the fridge and drank my orange juice straight out of the carton. Then she helped herself to my food, placing her hands in the likes of my cereal boxes and biscuits. She didn't even wash her hands after urinating in my sink. Then she walked just out of shot of the camera. I could see her arms moving, and then she walked over to the freezer, opened it, put her arm inside, then closed it. Did she just put something in my freezer? I went to the freezer to check it out, and this grown-ass woman had taken a shit in her hand while in my kitchen and put it in my freezer. I was absolutely in shock at what I just saw. I reported her to Airbnb and submitted the footage. I received some compensation, but this girl was a freak and not right in her head. I think she was banned from the platform after that, and since then, I've had no more weird encounters. Not yet, anyway. I'm a relatively well-known gamer on YouTube and other social media platforms. I'm not super famous or anything, but I do have a decent following, and for this reason, I would like to keep my identity anonymous. I had been gaming for about 6 months when I received a message through Kik asking if I wanted to partake in a meet in a nearby city. Truth be told, I thought it was a scam from the get-go and asked for some more info, and a man who called himself Henry said that I wouldn't need to pay for anything and that he would be renting out an Airbnb for us all to stay and game in. It sounded too good to be true, and I said I wasn't interested. Henry said they were developing a new platform that had some investors, and it was all 100% funded and legit. They had all the connections to make it happen, and had been watching me for a while, and believed we could help each other out. As much as my mom and my friends mocked me for wanting to be a professional gamer, I would do anything to try and elevate my status and earn a living from gaming, and so I decided I was all in, despite how much it sounded like a scam. Henry then sent me the booking confirmation of a house he had rented through Airbnb. The receipt read $1,200 for a weekend. This was crazy, and it looked super cool. The fact it had been booked and paid for proved the legitimateness of the event. The rooms all had double beds and ensuite. There was a hot tub outside in the garden, and there was nothing for kilometers around us, so we could be as loud as we wanted. The only condition was I had to bring all my own gear for the setup. I knew this was going to be a hassle, but it seemed worth it. It was a 2-hour drive away from my house, and so I set off in plenty of time with all my gear loaded in the back of the car. I was hella excited. I arrived at the address given to me just as it was starting to turn dark. I noticed straight away that there were no other cars in the driveway. I wasn't sure what was going on, so I went up to the door and knocked. There was no answer, and there were no lights on inside, meaning I was the first one there. I was in the wrong place, or no one else was coming. I walked around the house looking for any signs of life, but I found no one. I checked the details Henry had sent me. I even checked the pictures on the Airbnb app, and I was definitely in the right place. I decided to wait it out, and after about 30 minutes, I heard a rustling coming from the bushes about 60 feet to my right. I wasn't sure if this was a wild animal or not, but I didn't want to take any chances, and so I jumped in my car and reversed so I could shine my headlights towards the bushes. As I did, I saw a shadowy figure, which looked like that of a man, run off into the trees. I was getting scared now. I had arrived a little early, but we were now 20 minutes past the official meeting time, and no one else had turned up. I messaged Henry to find out where he was. As soon as I sent it, I could see he had seen the message, but he never replied. I said to myself that I was going to give it another 10 minutes, and then I was going to leave. 10 minutes later, no one else had arrived, and I had had enough. I put my car into drive and left for home. I never mentioned that the Airbnb was up a long drive on a private road, and as I was driving down, I noticed a car parked with its lights off, set back amongst the trees. I never noticed it on the way up, and it would have been easier for me to see from the other side, and due to it still being daylight. Something wasn't right, and I was starting to feel more and more like this was a setup. Just as I was going to pull off the private road, I noticed a faint shadow of a car tailing me. It had to be the car I had passed in the trees, and it still didn't have its lights on. I put my foot on the gas and was out of there as quickly as possible. I eventually got to the highway, and I didn't see anyone following me, so I decided to ease up off the gas. I was shaking and anxious and felt like I needed to pull over, but just wanted to get myself home. I kept checking my mirrors, making sure nothing was following me, and eventually I arrived home close to 6 hours after I had left. I never heard from Henry again. I was talking to my friend about the whole ordeal a few days later, and he suggested contacting Airbnb about the booking. They told me it was canceled a few days before, and the person that rented it received a full refund. The weirdest thing was, I had spoken to Henry that day, and he asked me what gear I was bringing to make sure he had enough plugs and extension cords for everyone. I think they planned on stealing my gear when I was there, as they knew I had over $2,000 worth of equipment. Luckily, they weren't stealth sneaking up on me, and I was able to get away unharmed and with all my gear.
On Valentine's Day of 1992, I was a 23-year-old wannabe musician living just outside of Redding, California. I had a part-time job at an auto shop 3 days a week, one that I had to get up at 7 a.m. for, and that year, Valentine's just so happened to fall on a Friday, which meant that I had to work from 8 until 3. But I'd also promised my then-girlfriend that I'd treat her to some special Valentine's Day dinner, complete with gifts and trip to the movies, meaning that I had around 1.5 hours to get home, freshen up, pick up all my girlfriend's gifts, and then pick her up at work on time. I wasn't looking forward to doing all that rushing around. I was kicking myself for not being more prepared, and I remember driving to work hoping that I might be able to clock out early or something. But then, when I show up at work, all the shutters are down and my boss's truck is nowhere to be seen. I figured that he was probably running a little late, which was way out of character for him, but I didn't immediately assume anything was wrong or anything like that. I just stayed put in my car, leaned back in the seat, and tried to catch a little extra shut-eye until I heard his truck roll into the lot. Next thing I know, I'm catching myself falling asleep, and when I open my eyes, it's almost 8:30 a.m. I've been sitting in that parking lot for almost 35 minutes, and my boss, who practically lived at the auto shop, just hadn't shown up for some reason. I had his home phone number written down somewhere, but this was in a journal back at my apartment, so instead of just sitting there like an idiot, I drove back to my apartment and gave him a call on my home phone. There was no answer at his place, so I left a message on his machine, then basically kind of just sat there, not knowing what to do. On the one hand, if my boss was sick or was off doing something and hadn't planned to open the shop that day, then it was no big deal at all. In fact, it was a blessing, because I had time to go buy my girlfriend her gifts and whatnot. But then no one called me, and I felt like I'd have known if we were going to be closed that day because I wouldn't have been all stressed out about the time. So instead of doing just nothing, I decided to give one of my coworkers a call, just to make sure that we weren't opening like an hour later that morning or whatever. But then he says the same thing. He hadn't gotten any calls, and as far as he knew, we were opening up at the regular time that morning. I then tell him about showing up to a shut shop and our boss not showing up even though I waited a while. I remember how there was a bit of a pause on the line as my coworker thought it over for a few seconds, and then he asked me, "Are you free to do something right now?" I obviously didn't have anything else planned, but then I also wanted to know what he was about to ask me, so I told him something like, maybe. It depends on what that something is. It turns out all he wanted to do was head over to our boss's house to see if he was okay. And since I figured that it'd take minimal time at best and was definitely the mature call, I agreed to head over there with him. About 10 to 15 minutes later, he pulls up outside my parents' place, honks his horn, and I run out and jump in his passenger seat. My coworker seems kind of tense, but other than that, we're still just two dudes on their way over to check on our boss. 'Cause like I said, not just showing up for work like that was way out of character for our boss. And the drive over to his place takes maybe 20 minutes, long enough for my coworker to get pretty worried, I think. I was still kind of looking on the bright side at the time, thinking maybe we might get the day off or something, and I suggested to my coworker that on the way over. He shot the idea right out of the sky, though, saying that the auto shop was our boss's life, how he only ever took Sundays off, and how if he was sick, he would have 100% called us to let us know and probably run things ourselves. And by the end of his little speech, I felt like a total jerk for even thinking about a day off, and was glad that I'd taken him up on the whole checking in on our boss thing. So, a few minutes later, we're turning off onto the road that our boss lives on, and although the houses aren't exactly huge, they're all nicely spaced out with privacy fences, big green hedges, and all that kind of stuff. We get to the house that belongs to our boss, and the moment we pull into the driveway, both me and my coworker get this really bad feeling, because our boss's door is just wide open and his truck is nowhere to be seen. I remember we both sat there on our seats, not saying a word, just looking at that wide open door. It wasn't some big red flag or anything, but that level of worry definitely got ramped up just a little more. Just not nearly as much as when my coworker reaches over, opens up his glove box, and pulls out a gun. I'd grown up around guns, so seeing one didn't freak me out or anything. It was the implication in that moment that had me afraid. I think I knew why he pulled it out too, but at the same time, I asked him what the heck was going on. My coworker told me to wait in the car, which immediately had me thinking, why the hell did you ask me to come along then? But then it hit me. He needed me there, just in case anything happened to him. He left his keys in the ignition, told me to shift over to the driver's seat, and that if he didn't come out in 5 minutes, to drive off and get the cops. I think up until that point, I'd never known what it meant to be truly terrified. I mean, I'd been afraid of all kinds of things, getting rejected by girls, getting picked up by the cops with some weed on me, or getting jumped on the way home from school. But I only think the word terror or terrified applies when there's a legitimate danger to human life. When my coworker got out of his car and walked towards our boss's house, there was a chance that he might never walk out again, and that was truly terrifying to me. It did occur to me that he could have been slightly overreacting, but by that point, he was already out of the car. And maybe that was wishful thinking on my part, my brain's way of doing a little psychological damage control. But either way, I watched him walk into the house, gun drawn, not knowing what the hell was about to happen. A few minutes later, my coworker comes walking out of the house, and he only makes it a few steps off the porch before he doubles over and starts puking. And that's when I knew at that moment that our boss was dead. Or at least that there had been some kind of dead body in there or something. Nobody just walks out of a house and throws up unless they've seen something truly messed up. And honestly, right then in that moment, I was really glad that he told me to sit in that car and not follow him into the house. The second he started to puke, I got out of the car and started asking what the hell was inside. And just like before, I think I already knew what he was going to say on some level. I just needed to hear it from him. He never said exactly what it was. He just told me our boss was dead, and that we needed to hang around and wait for the cops because he just called them on his home phone. I remember standing there behind his driver's side door, probably with some dumb, stupefied look on my face. I'd never been in a situation like that before, never even anything approaching something like that. It sort of didn't feel real either, like it was real for my coworker because he saw it, but for me, I don't know. It's like I wanted to see what was in that house just to confirm it wasn't some elaborate prank or something. But then, unless my coworker had just delivered an Oscar-winning acting performance, unless the entire morning had been some elaborate setup, what was happening was real, and I sure as hell didn't want to see what had made my coworker empty his guts out. I didn't know what else to say, so I asked how our boss died. And my coworker was still wiping his mouth on his t-shirt and spitting out the last of his puke when he told me in a very nasally voice, "Murder." I repeated back to him, "Murder?" Because I just could not believe what I was hearing at that moment. I thought maybe it had been some kind of accident, and unlike my coworker, I didn't immediately conclude that there was some kind of human threat involved. Hell, one of the first things that went through my head when my coworker said our boss was dead was that he had taken his own life. He could have blown his own head off with a shotgun, which sure as hell would have made me puke if it had been me walking in on the aftermath. But when my coworker said murder and nodded when I turned the word back on him in a question, that was the question of, how did he know it was murder? I only asked one more question to my coworker that morning before the cops showed up. I mean, that was the one that I just asked. How could he be so sure that it was murder? The answer that came back is one that I'll remember for the rest of my life. He's taped to a chair. Not long after that, the cops did show up, by which point my coworker had put his gun back in his glove compartment. And we both talked to the cops for a minute or two, then one of them went inside the house to look around. He came back out a minute or two later, not puking but definitely shaken. We talked to the cops a little more, gave them our contact info, then after that, we were told that we were free to leave. I remember wondering what was going to happen over the next few days, and when I asked my coworker what we should do now, he told me, file for unemployment. I asked him if we should get lawyers or something, if the cops might think that we did it or something, and he told me that he didn't think that it'd be necessary. He was right about both. The cops only got in touch with us once more, and the auto shop took years to find a buyer so it could reopen. But to me, that was just small stuff. I could find another job, and I did, pretty easily actually, but we both still wanted to know what had happened to our boss, or more accurately, why it had happened, which as it turned out was bizarrely easy for the cops. So remember, I said our boss's truck was missing when we showed up at his place. Well, it had been stolen by these two drug addicts who had the bright idea of doing a little home invasion on Valentine's Day Eve. They had heard, very inaccurately, that our boss was loaded, and that he had a bunch of gold bars or something stashed away in his house. He didn't, and he tells them that, but they didn't believe him. So they taped him to his computer chair, took off his shoes and socks, and began torturing him to get him to fess up. Obviously, he didn't have anything stashed away, and apparently he even offered to take them to an ATM so they would at least stop burning his feet with lighters and lit cigarettes. But no. They want the non-existent gold bars or bonds or whatever the hell they were looking for, so they kept on working their way up his legs until they got to his junk. I heard someplace that they were still torturing the guy when his heart just gave up and gave out on them. But still, they didn't want to leave empty-handed. So these two animals then took the keys to his truck and drove around trying to sell the thing in Reading. They didn't even drive to the next town over to throw the cops off their scent. And so a few hours after we spoke to the cops, some patrol unit was pulling over my boss's truck and arresting the two pieces of human trash who were in it. The female half of the couple later told the cops that the only reason they went looking for this big score like that was so she and her man could buy each other Valentine's Day gifts. To me, that's the only truly bizarre aspect of this whole thing. Once the people who killed him were arrested, they told the cops everything, down to the dumbest little details like that. I've heard that's like a thing with these meth heads, that they're prone to spill their guts to cops and stuff when other drug users can actually keep quiet and actually dodge charges. I don't know how true it is, but it seemed to have applied in their case. But then I've also heard the cops will dangle detox drugs in front of meth and heroin addicts, telling them that their jailhouse withdrawals won't be so bad if they only give up a little info. The point is, All the details came out in the months that followed, and I remember seeing the news about the pair getting sentenced around the holidays of that same year. Both got life in prison. But if you ask me, they should have dug a hole under that goddamn prison and thrown those two animals in there with no food or water until they just shriveled up and died. Anything else, in the face of what they did to my friend and my boss, seems like a slap on the wrist. My name is Brian. I'm from Ohio, and I've finally gotten around to typing up a story I've been wanting to share with you for quite some time. During late 2021 and early 2022, I started dating the girl who would later become my fiancée. I think a major episode in our dating timeline was around Valentine's Day of 2022. We'd only been talking for around 4 months at that time, so it wasn't a huge occasion for us or anything, but it also constituted a great opportunity to romance her a little. We both had work on Monday, which was the 14th, and that didn't really leave much room for whining and dining. So instead, we made plans to have dinner on the 12th, which was a Saturday night, so we could actually make the most of the occasion. I didn't mention anything about Valentine's Day, although I'm sure the implication was clear. But what I also didn't mention was that I was planning on booking a table at an extremely high-end fine dining establishment. I then went out and bought a whole bunch of her favorite snacks, just about anything she'd mentioned enjoying during our text exchange. I figured a bunch of small, fairly low-key gifts like that would demonstrate that I was a good listener, which, as much as that's kind of a dating cliché, is still super important in a relationship. Anyway, I make all the arrangements under the pretense of our destination being a surprise, and come the Saturday in question, she's under the impression that we are headed to this Italian place we'd been to once or twice before. Then, all of a sudden, I hit her with the old switcheroo, then take her to our actual destination, which was the fine dining place where I'd booked us a tasting menu. I'd never been to any place like that before, so I was actually super excited to try all the fancy food that was on the tasting menu. Even arriving at the restaurant and having the European waiting staff take our coats and escort us to our table, I could totally see why people pay for that kind of experience. It's not just all about the food. It's about the atmosphere and the service coming together to create truly special memories. And you can bet your bottom dollar that me and my future fiancé got a special memory of that night. It just wasn't the one we expected to have. So I think we're on our 4th course of 18, having a great time when the maitre d' seats another couple at the next table over. They look to be doing the same thing as us, having their early Valentine's dinner, only around 10 to 15 minutes after they sit down. The mood at their table became far from romantic, though. It started with a few sort of rude comments, things that made me and my future fiancé look up at each other with this sort of awkward kind of expression. But as the minutes ticked on by, things started to get worse and worse. They kept the volume down at first, but things got pretty vicious real quickly, to the point where one of the waiters came over to try and calm the situation down. It worked for like a minute, then the guy said something under his breath to the girl, and she stormed out of the restaurant. By that point, pretty much everyone in the restaurant was either aware of the tension in the room or was actively watching it unfold from their side eye. I'd seen plenty of public freakouts, just never anything in anywhere so fancy, so as much as I was kind of annoyed that they were ruining our experience, my future fiancée didn't seem all that disappointed. She wasn't strictly enjoying it, she just tried to look on the bright side and made me smile when she whispered, "Dinner and a show. You are treating me this evening." I think that's one of those moments that I knew that she was the one. When she knew how upset I'd be if I thought some total idiots had ruined our special evening and chose to brush it off like it was nothing. She was just as disappointed as I was. She just knew how much it would mean to me if she'd failed to show it. Anyway, after the girl stormed out of the restaurant, the guy stayed seated for a minute or two and then followed his girl outside. We figured that was the end of the show, but no. A few minutes later, the couple walked back into the dining room by the maitre d' and then reseated. It was actually almost comical, seeing everyone in the dining room trying to contain their disappointment at seeing these weirdos return. but I remember just genuinely hoping they'd smooth over whatever they were fighting about. I was dating seriously for the first time in my life, like actively looking for someone to settle down with, so seeing the marital discord that I feared being played out right there in front of me, it gave me this totally different kind of negative feeling when they started bickering for a second time. I honestly thought that's how the whole evening was going to go. This sort of toxic couple were going to poison the atmosphere completely, not having the good manners to argue elsewhere instead of in front of an entire dining room. But that's not what happened. All of a sudden, the girl gets up again, just like she did when she stormed out just a few minutes before. But then instead of just walking out of the restaurant, she stops, turns around, and takes off one of her high heels. The guy that she's with isn't looking at all. He's doing that thing of refusing to look back as she's walking away. Maybe out of pride, or maybe because he was looking at the menu, I don't know. But either way, he's about the only person in the dining room who doesn't see his girlfriend or wife or whatever pulling off one of her high heels, then taking hold of it like some weapon. By the time we all realized what she was planning, it was too late for anyone to do anything. The girl swung that shoe right at the guy's head, so the heel connected full force with his skull. And the sound that it made was nuts, way more muted and dull than I had expected, not a crack or a crunch at all. And then, instead of collapsing onto the table in front of him or just falling limp out of his chair, the guy just goes rigid. He almost propelled himself out of his chair, sending all kinds of glasses flying off the table in the process. Then, when he hit the floor, he started shaking and convulsing like he was having some kind of seizure. People started jumping into action, restraining the girl and rushing over to the guy, who by that point was bleeding all over the floor too, and my future fiancée was one of them. She was a registered nurse, and she knew exactly what to do, or rather, exactly what not to do when it came to the appropriate medical treatment. She told the waiters to drag the table away, so nothing else could fall onto the guy, and she took my jacket to cushion his head. After that, she basically just stayed with the guy until he stopped having this seizure, and the EMTs arrived to take him to the hospital. I don't know what happened to the girl. I didn't see her getting arrested or anything, and although people intervened to keep her from hitting the guy a second time, I don't think anyone tried to force her to stay. Probably because they were just scared that she'd hit them with the sharp end of that high heel shoe as well. And since the very horrifying effects were on display for all to see, I sort of understand why no one thought to just tackle her, or whatever. It was scary, legitimately frightening to see both the sudden escalation of violence and the effect that it had on the guy. It really drove the point home to me that real-life violence is much, much different to the kind that we're used to seeing on movies or TV. A few years ago, I met this guy on Tinder that I really liked, and we eventually went on a few dates together. We were talking for weeks, and our first date was nice, but then our second date fell almost exactly on Valentine's Day, and if I'm being honest, I was pretty excited about it. I just had no idea how things were about to take a pretty drastic turn. During the time we were talking, there were a lot of little red flags. He would tell me he drank too much, but I was a lot younger and naive back then and tried to give him the benefit of the doubt. We were in our early 20s, so I figured he just liked to party and it wasn't a problem. But what he didn't mention was the very specific effect that alcohol had on him. So on the night of our date, we were in a bar getting drinks and stuff, and he pulls out his phone very rudely, I might say, in the middle of a conversation. I asked him what was so important, and he tells me something like, "I'm trying to find us a way out of here." As you can imagine, I respond by saying, "You're doing what?" Thinking that it might have been like a joke or something. But no, he was deadly serious and started telling me how the security guards for the bar were, and I'm using his words here, after him. So I'm like, okay, let's go back to my car so maybe we can just go somewhere else, naively believing that he genuinely had beef with one or two of them. My car was parked pretty far away. I was staying pretty sober at that point because we had gone to multiple locations that night, so it took us a few minutes to walk there, but in that time, my date gets it into his head that multiple people are after him. I'm talking like random people on the street. Then once we're in a part of downtown that wasn't so busy, he started to think that I was out to get him too. I was trying to call his friend who was nearby to come get him, but he took my phone away from me because he thought I was calling the cops. Then, when I demanded that he return it, he started physically threatening me. I got so scared because I thought, if he hurts me here and leaves me here, nobody's gonna find me until morning, and it was really cold out. His friend eventually came and got him, and I left. Once I was safe, I was jittery all night from the anxiety, having been in rocky relationships in the past. I told him about it the next morning, and he didn't remember any of it, so I broke things off shortly after because I just did not have the time or energy to be dealing with anything like that. I feel like if I'd have carried on dating him, it'd only be a matter of time before he turned on me, physically, I mean, and then it wouldn't be so easy to just walk away. Not that I wouldn't be able to, he just struck me as the kind of guy who wouldn't let me leave.
This is from way back, when Silk Road 1 was still going strong. I was looking for a certain substance, but couldn't find it in my part of the world for a decent price. This was really frustrating because it'd been plentiful and easy to find in the past, but for whatever reason, things were dry and people were starting to look to alternatives. I was told about Tor and the Onion Rotary and how to access the Silk Road. For anyone that doesn't know what I'm talking about, Tor is like Google Chrome for the dark web. It's the program that you need to access the unique web page URLs that only have those websites. Silk Road was a dark web marketplace where you could buy and sell literally anything to one another. You had to use Bitcoin, and you had to trust a backwater system to get you what you paid for. The whole experience is totally surreal to look back on, but probably one of the coolest aspects in the early 2000s. Tor was called the Onion Rotary because it randomized your IP with every click of the mouse. So 1 minute it might say you were in Vermont, the next you were in Peru, and then Helsinki. You get the picture. It's an untraceable system, unless, of course, you underestimate the means of the system and can trace people, but that's a whole nother discussion entirely. So I got Tor, and I got onto the dark web. I found myself on Silk Road. All seemed to be pretty straightforward, so I just made my post like I would on Craigslist or any other messaging board. Hi, looking for mushrooms, please respond. Was pretty much the gist of it. It felt sketchy and stupid, but out of options, I gave it a whirl. When I checked the next morning, I hadn't received any messages, and I pretty much wrote it off. The hell was I thinking anyway? But after a few days, someone did respond. They had an offer and requested to message me, which I accepted. We parlayed the details. Suddenly, I found myself agreeing to send the stranger around $800. This was way more than I originally planned on spending, but for whatever reason, I found the person I was talking to charming. Drug dealers seemed to have that effect on me, so that's how I knew this guy was legit. I only had $200 set aside for the purchase, so the additional $600 was biting into my rent and bill money. I had to convert all of it into Bitcoin, then ship it off to a random wallet address. Honestly, the whole thing felt pretty high-tech and cool at the time. After payment, the guy agreed to ship me 1 ounce of mushrooms per week for 6 weeks. The delayed nature of it kept it safer, more secure, and would allow me to make more sales over time. It all made sense in my head. Lo and behold, the delivery never arrives. 2 weeks goes by, nothing, and the guy's account vanishes from my contact history. That charm I felt, it was that of a scam artist. I just couldn't tell the difference through a computer screen. I felt stupid, as there was nothing I could do, but the real problem was, I was planning on selling that first shipment to cover the rent money I'd spent. I wouldn't be able to cover my ass in 2 weeks when the first of the month came. I had all kinds of problems to deal with in real life now, so I did the one thing that I could do to get revenge on the dark web. I left that guy a bad review on the Silk Road forum. I said he scammed me, had probably scammed many others, and then not to give him any money. Do not conduct business of any kind with this guy. He will definitely steal your money. After that, I did my best to forget and just start hustling to get the bills covered. It's grueling, but I did find some side gigs and start filling up the coffers before the next month. I come home one day and I just want to relax, veg out on the computer for a little bit. I remember that whole dark web ordeal and decide to go take a look at my Silk Road post. And that's when I see I have a new message. It went along like this. Hello, I'm a reputable vendor here on Silk Road. I saw your post this morning about the scam artist user. I had an exchange with him a few days ago, wherein he also tried to scam me. So I'm taking actions against him. I've used one of my alternative accounts to sell him several ounces of MDMA. He's already paid for the product, and what I put in the mail was a 1/4 pound of sweet sugar crystals and a sticky note with a frowny face, with his full name written on it. Is there anything else you'd like this user to suffer? I had no idea who this person was that was messaging me, but they were allowing me to come up with consequences for that guy. It was some kind of honor among thieves, and honestly, I found it enthralling. What a message to receive, that the Silk Road system was self-correcting. Unfortunately, I didn't really have any creative ways off the top of my head to make him suffer, so I didn't make any suggestions. The vendor told me that was okay. The user would have lots to deal with in the coming weeks. Then he asked for my Bitcoin wallet address and the amount owed from the scam. I thought long and hard about my answer. Part of me wanted to lie, see if I could turn a profit from the whole ordeal. But another part of me was sure this person could find out the truth. It was the dark web. These people could find out anything. If I lied, it might cost me more in the end. So I just told him the truth, which even then sounded pretty steep. He gave me the okay and said he'd be back to me soon. No way. It was unbelievable, but my bad review was actually going to get me my money back. After the experience that I had, I wasn't really sure any of this was legit. When I woke up the next morning though, all the money had been returned to my wallet. I wish I could explain the sensation that I had, like my spirit had been refilled. I believed in humanity, and of course, carried a deep respect for the dark web community after this. While randomly clicking around Tor one night, I found a site with a riddle and a text box to enter the answer. After figuring out the puzzle, it took me another page that had a message to decode and another text box. Basically, every page was a puzzle, and it got harder every time. I was 15 years old and not very smart with those kind of things, so I found a forum where other people had discovered it too, and were all talking about it. Apparently on the final page, it displayed a date and a quote from Alice in Wonderland. I believe it was just a site just to be some sort of entertainment for very experienced decoders and programmers, but there's also some speculation. It might be a hacker recruiting site, similar to the Cicada 3301, but either way, it creeped me out a lot. Despite all these fears though, I couldn't look away. I was big into breaking secret codes, and this seemed to be a brain buster. The forum I found became incredibly handy, almost like a video game guide. It helped me figure out some of the later puzzles. You see, I wanted to do them all on my own. Any good code breaker knows that there's possibly more than one way to solve a puzzle, and the results could yield different outcomes. I'd spend a few hours after school each day trying to figure out the latest riddle. It didn't take long. Soon I was at the same page everyone else had arrived at, a date and a quote. But there's something else too. This disgusting bloody pig mask sitting on the end of a table next to the text. Maybe it wasn't even a mask, it could have been a legit pig head, severed right off the body. I mean, it was that gory looking. There were a few people in the forum claiming that there were additional levels after that one that I'd already reached, but the vast majority of the decoders denied this and said the text box with the quote and date was the end of this puzzle. I didn't know who to believe though, but having a lot of free time and already being invested, I decided to keep at it. Maybe there was more. I reached out to one of the conspirator guys, asked him how to move beyond the pig head page. He didn't respond at first, but after some prodding, he came back pretty hostile with all kinds of threats. This guy didn't see the decoding as a puzzle. He saw it as a race to some kind of prize, so he wanted to keep his progress to himself. He said he'd hack me, turn my life upside down if I bothered him again. This only fueled my interest though. As you probably figured out, I was a supreme nerd throughout high school, somewhat versed with the dark web. I had some smoke and mirrors in place to mask my IP from unwanted investigation. As the week went on, a few more decoders moved on from the last level. I was one of them. I don't want to get too deep into what the puzzle was, but we figured out that there was a code hidden in the date and the quote on the screen. If you typed in the missing characters, it sent you to another screen. The next screen had a question in a text box and a timer starting at 3 minutes, and the rest of the bloodied corpse of the pig. Now I knew it wasn't a mask. It was a real series of photos of a decapitated animal. The gruesome nature of the photo made it incredibly hard to focus on the puzzle at hand. The timer made it even worse. When it hit 0, it kicked you back to the latest puzzle text box where you had to wait 24 hours to input the secret characters. Here's the rub. Every time you returned and went into the next puzzle, the timer was 30 seconds shorter. You were only given 6 attempts to get it figured out, and if you spent all 6 tries, that was it. Puzzle game over. This one took the form a little longer to figure out, as no one wanted to be the martyr and sacrifice their attempts. It also really cut off what little communication and cooperation was left between users. After 9 or 10 days, people started dropping like flies, unable to stay away from giving the next screen a shot. People were going nuts in the forum area after they lost. I tried to be as patient as I possibly could, spent night after night trying to piece it together on paper rather than waste my tries. It wasn't good enough though. Eventually, after conversing with a few puzzlers that were still helpful, I decided to give it a run, see if it worked out for me. I didn't really believe this would end in fame or riches, so I didn't think I'd lose out on anything. It was just a fun pastime for me. Needless to say, I failed, quickly at that. All the stuff I came up with on paper crashed and burned as soon as my screen was frozen on the previous puzzle, doomed to only lurk in the forum now. It was whatever. I hung around for a few more days to see if anyone passed, and got bored and moved on. The dark web is a deep place. There are lots of other things to see. In my defense, I didn't totally fail. I actually saved my last attempt just in case anything came to me, or in the event the answer got posted somewhere. Still, I forgot about the whole thing as I moved on to other strangeness on that web. Not even a week went by when I got an email from an encrypted account. And I don't mean that message itself was encrypted, although it probably was. I mean the actual email account itself was unreadable, untraceable. I had no way of responding because to my email sender, the account that sent it didn't exist. I had a bad feeling the second I saw that mysterious point of origin. It had one simple message. Hey, keep at it. You were really close and we'd like to see you succeed. Give that last try a shot. From your friends on the other side. I started to sweat before I even finished reading it. All the precautions I took were meaningless. Someone from the dark web had found my personal email account and then reached out to me. This meant they knew my name, house address, really everything about me. Privacy was non-existent. Suddenly I found myself afraid of the electronics inside my house. This was when my interest in the dark web really soured. I quit with it altogether. I didn't really do anything online after that. I'd unplug my Wi-Fi as soon as I was home and if no one was using it. I changed my passwords to things that I had to use, like stuff for school. I was so nervous after that email that I could hardly sleep at night, just waiting for my life to fall apart. What would it start with? Another email? A phone call? A text message? It came in the way I would least expect it. The mail. I came home from school one day to find something waiting for me on the kitchen counter. It looked like junk mail at first, your typical "you've won" type of envelope. It wasn't until I saw the symbol stamped beside the heading that I realized what it was. It was an image of a pig's head. I tore it open with dread, tremoring throughout my entire body. Part of me hoped it was full of anthrax and would just kill me right there. I would have been lucky that that happened. Inside I found a photo and a small white card that read, "You work so hard." The picture was me, hard at work on the last puzzle in front of my computer. It looked like the picture had been taken through my webcam or some program. I was leaned back in my desk chair, staring at the possibilities I'd written out on paper. It was a gut-wrenching thing to see. All the notions I'd been safe were washed away in an instant. I took the envelope and its contents to the fireplace and burned it right there on the spot, sweat dumping down my body as I watched it turn to ash. Nothing more ever came from it, but the fact that it happened changed the way I looked at the world. I don't do much online, and when I do, it's limited, through various layers of security. No one is safe anywhere on the web. I'll never forget hearing about the dark web and all the crazy stuff that you could find on there. My friends and I in high school loved the legends of the internet. Spent a lot of time cruising places like Reddit and 4chan for weird stuff, both old and new. We weren't really after anything specific, we just liked the shock factor aspect and the unpredictability of what you might find. I think my generation was really drawn to this kind of behavior because of things like LimeWire. I mean, we were the first wave of kids to be handed electronics, an internet connection, and then just left to our own interests. This was the first era where a person could hear something and then go to the web and learn more about it. Whereas many of us were just downloading songs and music videos, others had learned you could pretty much download anything from LimeWire. This turned the program into a kind of weird roulette, where you never knew what you might see. One minute you think you're downloading a My Chemical Romance song, and then it's actually a decapitation video. So as you can imagine, we were pretty fascinated with the notion of the dark web. At first, it was just something we talked about, random stuff we'd heard and rumors we made up, or horror stories that we read online. All of it kindled a fascination that just wouldn't go away. Not until we saw it. There's no other way to describe it. The dark web is the last frontier. It's the one place a person can truly explore and possibly see something no other human will. We started learning about what a trip would require. None of us wanted to use our own devices to make that journey, so we entertained getting a burner laptop. Of course, being school-age kids, we didn't have a lot of disposable money like that. The urge to take the plunge was just overwhelming one day that I didn't care. It's not like going on the dark web is illegal. It's all about what you do when you get there. I told everyone that I was just going to figure it out with my computer at home. It took me a couple of days worth of research, but I got it figured out. I'm not going to lay it out so you can make the same mistakes I did though. I'll just say it requires a special browser to access. If you really want to go, you'll have to learn the rest yourself. I made the proper modifications, downloaded the software I needed, and then started experimenting. Getting to the dark web is actually a lot easier than they say. The hard part is navigating it. There aren't any URLs like the regular internet. You have to know the highly specific web addresses in order to find the site. This prevents just any crackerjack from getting onto the dark web and taking a tour of some potentially seedy places. Not to be deterred, I went to my old friend 4chan. The anonymous users there had some pointers for me, mostly to tell me to stay away, but after a night of asking and bartering, I was finally given a copy-paste link to a list of dark web URLs. There were thousands of them. I remember feeling lightheaded when I saw it. I couldn't even imagine all the different crazy stuff that lay archived before me. So I started the same way anyone would, one link at a time. I can't even express to you how disappointed I was when I dropped that very first link in and it took me to a dead website. I thought I'd been tricked, totally ripped off. The first 10 or 20 links were all the same dead website. Still, I wasn't going to give up. I spent a year of my high school life talking about the wonders of this place. I couldn't just tuck tail and say, nah, guess I was wrong. There's a whole lot of nothing. I did what any sensible young man would do. I jumped ahead in the links. In fact, I found the sketchiest looking one I could find and followed it. And this time, that website wasn't dead. It was some kind of online marketplace. And as you can imagine, all the items for sale weren't things you could buy in a store. I stumbled upon some kind of fetish site where you could buy urine. And I mean any kind in the world. It looked like the site mostly dealt with clean urine, as the kind that would pass a drug test. I I hit the mother lode. I scrolled for a little while just to make sure I didn't miss anything. After all, I was an explorer. I needed to make an accurate report to my buddies. The rest of the night went by slow, as methodic research does. My friends were floored when I told them. They couldn't believe I'd actually found something, and that I've done it all on my home computer. They kept asking me if I was crazy, and if the FBI was monitoring my house yet. Despite all the crap talking, every single one of them wanted to see what I'd found. For a few weeks after this, my friends would come over after school, usually when my parents were at work. We'd try random URLs from the copy-paste list. The list itself was hosted on one of those old text-sharing websites, so anyone could make a change to the document at any given time. There'd be times where we'd watch someone delete a URL, or type out a new one at the bottom. We actually had our own list going of websites we visited, and websites that were dead. I can't even begin to tell you all the crazy stuff that we saw. It started with a weird urine website, but that was truly the tip of the iceberg. Hell, that's just the kind of website you can find on the normal internet nowadays. Pee in bags, farts in jars, typical OnlyFans stuff. It's almost as if the depravity of the dark web has slowly bled into the normal internet over the last few years. Anyway, we moved on to cooler URLs. One week we explored another marketplace that conducted itself more as a forum. It wasn't goods that were being moved, but a service. The members of this forum claimed to be hitmen from a variety of backgrounds, all with different skill sets and different types of targets that they were comfortable killing. This last part varied greatly, and it was reflected in the price tag. Average killers willing to kill average people were asking for about $20,000 in either American or Mexican currency. The higher prices were in the ballpark of $100,000 to $50,000 up front, and then $50,000 after the kill was carried out. These were typically for the more high-profile targets. The seller accepted only American or Russian currency. It was definitely mind-blowing to see, but there was no way to actually verify any of this. Part of us was convinced that it was all just people role-playing, just pretending to be what they said they were. We got curious, so we made an account on a Hitman forum. It didn't really require a whole lot. As you can imagine, less is more for a Hitman forum. It seemed to be a way just to network, and then the actual details and money would be exchanged later, most likely in person. We perused the website, but we didn't find anything we considered proof that what we were seeing was actually real. While poking around the website though, a little blue bubble appeared in the top right corner of my screen. It kind of looked like an eyeball, but it was only the size of a pinky nail. I didn't think anything of it at first, honestly. I just thought it was something with the browser, like it needed an update or something, and just kept on exploring. It wasn't until we were done for the day and everyone was going home that I noticed it again. Even after closing the programs we used to surf the dark web, that little blue bubble was still in the top right corner, now set against my monitor background. I did everything I could to scrub the bubble from my computer, but to no avail. Restarts, long-term shutdown, antivirus scans, software purge, everything. It was a part of my computer, and I guess I just had to deal with it, which turned out to be not an issue. Being a young dumb kid, forgetting about the bubble was like second nature to me, and believe it or not, we kept on exploring the dark web, despite that little eye looking out at us. Another couple of weeks went by before we found a website that greatly interested all of us. It was a black market for hackers and data pirates. There were resumes for hackers on there, list of things they could do for you, even some stuff they could teach you. It was like a hub for keylogging and backdoor sneaking. For whatever reason, being on this website didn't scare us, even though this seemed to be the spot where the bad stuff would really happen. We hung around that website for a while until one day, that little blue bubble disappeared from the corner. We all looked at each other and laughed, letting the fright pass over us, and then kept on exploring. The webpage grayed out. A text box popped up on the screen. We all started whooping and hollering as if we just finished a video game level, despite having no clue what we just stumbled upon. The message went something like this. Hello, I'm one of the administrators for this website. We log everyone who passes through the best to our ability. but I've continued to monitor your activity since your first appearance on our website. I've seen you on our servers every day, and I've come to the conclusion you have no interest in buying or using any of the services listed. I suspect even if you had an interest, you would have no way of paying for it, because you're a group of high school kids who bit off more than you can chew. The guy went on to explain that we weren't in any kind of trouble, and that the admin team didn't mind them looking around, but others would. Because of the sensitive nature of the website, lots of real hackers lurk just below the surface. And since I was on my home computer, using my family's internet without any kind of virus protection, my connection to the dark web was comparable to a flashing red sign with all of my personal information on it. I had no idea that my presence on each website was a flagship for people to come and take advantage of me. He then said if I took more precautions to protect my connection, I would be safe and secure in my exploring. He went on to ask if I had noticed a little blue bubble on my monitor screen. I typed back yes. It had been there for a week or two. The administrator explained that I picked up a hitchhiker on one of these dark websites, and that the person was tracking everything I did. They couldn't see me through the screen or anything, but they could see everything I did on our home internet, likely in an attempt to blackmail us. The administrator explained that when he looked into my connection, he took the liberty of removing my hitchhiker. "You should get off now if you know what's good for you," was the last message that I received from them. We all looked at each other with that same sense of disbelief. Being high school boys, we needed more than just a spooky message. One of my friends leaned over my shoulder and typed, "How do we know this is legit? Anyone could be making this up." The admin proceeded to respond with my full name and address, the whole names of several other friends inside the room, the school that we all went to. We frantically closed out the browser, and I can tell you that I've never been on the dark web since.
Ever since I can remember, I always wanted to be a nurse, and when the time came, my parents paid for me to attend the nursing program at my nearby junior college. My last year of high school should have been a sign of what was to come, and despite all of my hard work, it just really wasn't to be. I managed to complete the first year, but my grades were so bad that I wasn't allowed to re-enroll for my second year. My parents were disappointed to hear this, but no one was as sad as I was. I felt like a failure for a long time. After a few months, I pulled myself together and began planning my next move. For the moment, I had no real clear path with my life, but I was certain of one thing. Above anything else, my parents deserved to be paid back. They naturally insisted that it wasn't necessary, but I made up my mind already and nobody was going to change it. But without a job, this was just not going to be possible, and therefore I began the search the following day. It wasn't long until I was hired at a small diner downtown. I never waited tables in my life, but it was a paying job, and that was all that really mattered to me at that moment. I took my new job rather quickly. It wasn't as difficult as I really expected. The shorthand was the hardest part, but once I'd learned it, everything else was pretty much gravy. I'd been at the diner about 3 months when this guy, John, first came in for lunch. John, quote-unquote, as he asked that I call him, was this older guy. He was thin and wiry, and that first Sunday, he just so happened to be seated in my area. And from there on, he made it a point to always be seated where I was working. I could tell that he was special from the start. I felt unusually comfortable speaking to him. We'd exchanged names before I even had a chance to get his coffee. It was like I was speaking to a family member. And despite his reserved manner, he was very honest about his life and the mistakes he'd made. On one of those Sundays, I mentioned his tattoos and he proceeded to tell me all about them. I was shocked when he said that he'd served 20 years in prison earlier in his life. My perception of what a criminal looked like changed greatly after meeting him. His teens and early 20s were chaotic, and his abuse of alcohol and drugs led him into a life of crime. One day he found himself neck-deep in a plot to actually rob a bank. The robbery did not go well, obviously, and after a member of the public was injured, he had to go on the run. He was eventually caught, and his reluctance to name the rest of the gang meant that he was given the maximum penalty. And after serving the majority of his sentence, he was released, I guess, in the early 2000s. But since that time, He had been keeping his nose completely clean, and most of his life was now spent between work and church, and he had just left services that Sunday when he first dropped into the diner. If I was a religious person, I might think that we were destined to meet. It was during one of his other Sunday visits where my reason for waiting tables was brought up. John asked why a girl as intelligent as me was serving food. I told him about my dreams of becoming a nurse and my failed attempt at school. He talked about regrets and failures in his life. On his way out that day, he urged me to give it a second try at school before I got too old. In his mind, all I needed was a little life experience and I'd do better the next time. I knew that he was just being nice for my sake, but I'll admit that his energy was very motivating. I thought my dream was in the past, but hearing his encouraging words proved me wrong. Psyched up or not, that phase of life was going to have to wait until I paid my parents back. And for the present, work was my focus, and I continued working every shift available, and every Sunday, John and I would grow more familiar with each other. This lasted for roughly 3 months until he stopped showing up. I guess that he was sick or busy or something and figured that he'd come back the next Sunday, but when that next Sunday arrived and he was nowhere to be seen. After 3 weeks of no-shows, I just gave up hope. It was a sad day when I realized that he wasn't coming back. He'd kind of become a father figure to me in that brief time, and his encouraging words had lifted me from the hole of disappointment that I'd been in for the past year. Unfortunately, life is a series of meetings and goodbyes, I guess. I picked myself up and just carried on with my work. Soon, I'd all but forgotten about this John guy, and 5 months passed, and one afternoon I was doing something in the back when the head cook said someone wanted to speak to me. I walked out and saw a middle-aged man standing by the cash register. He introduced himself as a police officer from our local department. When I asked what he wanted, he handed me this manila envelope with my name written on it. He proceeded to tell me that John had left it behind for me. I was naturally confused and asked what it was. He couldn't tell me, and I was beginning to get annoyed with him. When I started to press him for it, he made it clear that he couldn't say anything else other than that John was dead. I'd suspected that this may have actually been the case, but hearing it out loud started to really hurt a lot. I didn't have the heart to go on after that, and I just simply thanked the detective and he left. With the envelope in my hand, I went back to open it. I now wish that I never had. Inside was a stack of money with a bank band wrapped around it, and my mouth grew drier as I counted it. I recounted it several times and came up with the same amount, $10,000. Along with the cash, a note was included and it read, "If you're reading this, I'm dead. I'd wanted to give it to you myself, but my old life caught up with me. Take this and pay your parents what you owe them. Use the rest to go back to school. You're too smart to be waiting tables at some greasy spoon. Life is too short to have regrets. Good luck and don't give up on your dreams. You got this." At the bottom of the page was his full signature, a name I'd never gotten the chance to learn, and there was a ton of emotions flowing through me in that moment. His faith in me was touching beyond belief, far more than I ever had in myself. My mind drifted from the money for a brief time, but a sick feeling quickly came rushing through me a moment later. What was all this? Where had John gotten all this money from? He was some ex-con who drove a 20-year-old truck and painted houses for a living. I read back through his note, and a chilling line got my attention. My old life caught up with me. What did he mean by this? Did he rob a bank or steal it from somewhere else? My heart began pounding out of my chest, and I'm terrified that somebody may be looking for this money and it leads them to me. I've also considered the possibility that it's all a setup by the police, and maybe they think I was part of the theft and are waiting for me to do something else. I'm not a criminal. I don't know how these types of things work. It's been 2 weeks since I got the envelope, and I still have no idea what to do with it. I still go to work every day like normal, but I'm always looking around for something to happen. I hate to involve other people in this, but I think I need advice from you guys. What do you think I should do? The money would solve all of my problems and set me up for the future, but I can't shake the feeling that something bad's gonna happen. Let me know what you think, and I could really use all the help that I can get.
I work at Dunkin, and this is something that happened several months ago. I've had the job for almost a year. The location that I work at doesn't seem to be that busy most of the time. I guess it's not in the most populated area, but we do get a good amount of people during the morning rush. That's when a lot of people stop by for coffee and donuts. But other than that, we're pretty quiet for much of the day. On the day of this story, I was working a shift that started in the morning and ended in the late afternoon. So when I got there, I think about 10 a.m., we were somewhat busy. The busiest time of the day had passed, but I was working with 2 other coworkers. Shortly after I got there, one of them left, and by 2 p.m., I would be all by myself. Now, I would say at around 1 p.m., I was standing behind the counter and no customers were inside. Then a man walked in. He was a larger guy with blondish colored hair and a bit of a beard which was the same color. After entering, he walked up to the counter right in front of me. I said hi, and the man said that he would have an everything bagel with cream cheese. Unfortunately, we had run out of everything bagels that day. We likely wouldn't have any more until the next morning. After I told the man we didn't have any everything bagels, I thought maybe he would order something else. Instead, he just said okay and walked out. Now, about an hour went by. We got a couple customers in that time, but not many. Then the same man walked in. When I realized it was him again, I found it a little bit interesting. He walked up to the counter once more and ordered the same thing as before. I told him we still didn't have any of that kind of bagel. Without saying a word or even showing any kind of emotion, he just left again. Now I found this to be strange. I didn't really know what this guy's situation was, but it only gets weirder. About 30 minutes after that, the man came back. The same as the first 2 times, he walked in and approached me at the counter. He asked for an everything bagel again. I told him we still didn't have any and wouldn't for the rest of the day. Then I asked him why he kept coming in here and ordering it. The man denied ever being in here before. He said this was his first time. I thought that he was joking, even though he wasn't smiling and actually seemed serious. I told him that he was here 2 times before and ordered the same thing, but he claimed that he wasn't here. I was telling him how he had come before and stuff, but as I was talking, he just walked out and left the place again, completely ignoring me. I thought that it was really strange. By that time, I was just working by myself. We really weren't that busy anymore at all. So I kept working and things were slow as expected. For the next probably hour or so, we had only maybe 3 or 4 people come in. Then the man returned. This time though, I spotted him at a window. Like many Dunkins, we have some large windows so you can see a lot of outside. I just remember noticing the man standing outside of the window and just looking in. He put his hands up against the glass and moved his face really close. He was just staring in with wide eyes. It was really creepy, to be honest. He just kept staring in, and after a while, I waved at him. Nothing happened though, and he didn't move. This went on for the longest time. I thought about going outside, but decided not to. As time went on, the expression on his face seemed to get angrier and angrier. Eventually, after about 10 minutes, he finally walked away. I tried to see where he was going, if he drove here or what, but he just walked around the building out of my sight. It seemed as though he went into another property nearby after that. I was so weirded out by the whole thing. I still don't know what happened. Since that day, I haven't seen the man. I used to work overnights at a 24-hour Dunkin. I'm not sure whose idea it was for us to be open 24 hours, but nobody ever came in late at night. At least not to the location that I worked at. It was actually kind of nice though, because I never really had to do that much work. By the time I left, the morning employees would be there. They would take care of the busy time in the morning. That's when everybody would be getting coffee and stuff before work. But I didn't have to worry about that. I would just help the few people that got coffee in the late night and overnight hours. One night I was working and obviously by myself. I think that it was about 2 o'clock in the morning at this time. We hadn't had any customers in a while. I was just chilling behind the counter, sort of in the back. I remember hearing the door open, so I moved closer to the counter to see who was there. I expected a customer to come up and order something, but instead, the first thing I saw was a man walking through the lobby and sit down at a table. The guy never faced me and was looking in the opposite direction the whole time, so I didn't really see his face at all. He was also wearing a sweatshirt with a hood and was looking down. He then sat down at a table, facing completely away from me. I found this behavior to be slightly suspicious, but still, I wasn't going to freak out or anything. I stood there for about a minute in case he got up to order something, but he stayed there. I couldn't tell if he was on his phone or something. That's what I assumed he was doing, because he was just looking down at the table, it appeared. When it became apparent that he probably wasn't going to get up and order something, I moved away. I went a little bit more into the back where I could chill and go on my phone or whatever. I couldn't really see much about in the lobby from there, but I could see part of it. For example, I could basically just see the register and where people would order, as well as part of the donut case. I was back there for probably like 10 minutes. I didn't see or hear anything, so I assumed that the man was still just sitting there. I got up to walk back over to the counter. As soon as I got back out, I saw the man standing there. He was to the right of where you order, but right in front of the counter. He was facing me, except I saw that he had very long hair, and it was coming down in front of his face. It was a very creepy sight. I could barely see any part of his actual face because of it. Was he trying to scare me or something? I walked over to him and asked if I could help. Instead of ordering something, or even answering me, the man then jumped over the counter. I quickly moved to the side and away from him. Now that he was on the employees only side of the counter, he started running over to me. When he got close, he reached out to grab me. I moved away just on time though, and I ran for the door and left the building. The man did not chase me outside and remained in there. So I went for my car, which was the only vehicle in the parking lot. I got inside, locked the doors, and then called the police. Then I waited in my car for them to arrive. If the man came out and chased after me at any point, I would be able to drive away. Luckily, he didn't. The police got there a short time later and then entered the building. They found the man crouched down behind the counter. When he was located, the guy tried fighting off the officers before he was eventually arrested. I think that he was under the influence of drugs, and that was to blame for his crazy behavior. After this experience, I wanted to get off the night shift as soon as possible. It took 2 weeks, but I was soon able to. Not long after that, I quit Dunkin and moved on. That was by far the scariest thing that happened while I worked there.
I started taking evening walks around campus in my final year of college. It wasn't long before I began noticing that it helped me keep my weight down and clear my head after a long day of work. After graduation, I kept up the practice and continued doing it to this day. While many of those around me had become diabetic and hypertensive, causing them to become dependent on multiple medications, I have none of those problems. In fact, my blood pressure is consistently well within the normal range, just as my weight and blood sugar are, and at present, I'm the only member of my family able to make such a claim, actually. As I approach my 43rd birthday, I see no reason to ever stop those post-dinner walks. For anyone reading this interested in getting healthier, I recommend walking over jogging every time. You get all the benefits without the wear and tear on your body that you often get from running. Knee problems come to mind specifically. Anyways, like everything in life, there will always be a few downsides to any activity though. Most of those will come from the outside world and those things that you just can't control. The story I'm telling today involves one such downside. The setting was a nice, cool summer evening. I had just completed a wonderful dinner with my family and set out for my usual 4-mile trek around my neighborhood. I'd made this walk 1,000 times and never encountered anything worse than a dog who'd escaped from its owner. These walks, being one of the rare times in my life I got to myself, I'd use it to plan out my future or just enjoy the beautiful music of nature going on all around me. For this reason, I generally walked alone. Although I never stopped anyone from coming along, I think my family realized that I preferred the solitude. On this night, the sun was just beginning to dip below the horizon. I was coming up to the midway point where I turned for home. My street comes to a dead end exactly 2 miles from my house. At that dead end, there's a big oak tree that I walk around. I have no particular reason to do it, it just became a habit after a while. Anyway, I just made my turn and was heading back when a man's voice boomed out from behind me. "Good evening, neighbor." I almost jumped out of my skin when I heard it. I looked over my shoulder and saw a man jogging up to me. I was so annoyed that I actually barked a curse at him. He seemed to come out of nowhere. There was a bunch of trees off to the left, but I didn't see or hear anyone over there when I passed by. Something about it just didn't seem right, though. It was getting dark, but from what I could tell, I'd never seen the man before, and I had no interest in making friends at that moment, especially this guy. His popping up from behind me had me in a bad mood. I'm not usually a rude person, but something about him bothered me, and it went beyond his sneaky arrival. I attempted to just lose him, but he actually eventually caught up. Now I was sure that I didn't know him. "It's unseasonably cold for this time of the year, isn't it?" His attempt at small talk kind of grated on me, and I could feel the scowl on my face. All I wanted at that moment was just to get home. I fought the urge to tell him to just buzz off. I didn't want to be rude. Despite being clueless, he'd done nothing wrong, really. We walked another mile or so together before my house showed up, and this entire time he'd continued rambling on about nothing important, and I didn't really say anything back. The relief that I felt seeing my house in the distance was quickly replaced by this sense of dread. I wasn't sure if I wanted this annoying man to know where I lived. Instead of turning onto my street, I just kept walking. I had no plan of how I was going to shake the guy, but I figured that I'd come up with it as I walked. We carried on for about 20 yards or so before he said something that just made my blood run cold. "Hey, Nick, isn't that your street we just passed?" This sort of sick feeling washed over me, and I actually felt like I broke out into a cold sweat. I took another step and everything just kind of went silent. An indescribable rage boiled inside of me. I could hear my heart pounding inside my head, and finally I blew up on the man in a way I'd never had before on anyone. I screamed at him, "Who in the hell are you? I'd never met you before in my life, and how do you know my name?" "I know I didn't tell it to you," I said. A smug smile seemed to kind of spread across his face, and it was just beyond spine-chilling in that moment. "Well, it looks like you got me." He was already this rather imposing gentleman, but that smile made him just monstrous in my eyes. An air of menace poured off of him like cheap cologne, and I grew more nervous the longer I stood there, but despite the terror that I felt, my ego prodded me to just assert myself there. To some onlooker, it might have been like seeing a sardine trying to intimidate a great white. "I don't know who in the hell you think you are or why you decided to bother me, but I can promise you that if you ever bother me again, I'll shove my foot so far up your you-know-what. You'll need a surgeon to remove it." I actually said that. It was laughable, and it was an empty threat. I'm an average-sized man, but he could have bent me into a pretzel if he really wanted to. By this point, I was so scared and angry that I was shaking uncontrollably. I'm sure that he could see it, and it probably went a long way assuring him that he had the upper hand. Even after all of my sort of threats and yelling, that weird grin that he had never seemed to fade. There was another long, uncomfortable silence. I was almost relieved when that guy finally spoke. "Have a nice night, Nick." I was at a loss at how to react, so I just turned and began walking toward home. Every few yards or so, I'd look over my shoulder to ensure that he wasn't following. Each time, I half expected him to pop up right behind me and strangle me to death with his massive hands. I kept this up until I got inside my house. And now that I was, quote-unquote safe, the fear overwhelmed me so much that I had to run to the bathroom, and I legitimately vomited. I'd never done that before, but once I heaved up my entire dinner, I rinsed out my mouth and washed my face in the sink. and I kind of stared at myself in the reflection, wondering why I'd reacted so negatively to that guy. Never in my life have I ever had an experience like this, nor can I fully explain what had happened. All I know is that every cell in my body told me to just get away. His very presence just felt wrong for some unexplainable reason, and this made me hate him. Had he not acted so strange when I confronted him, I may still be questioning my behavior. Now, I know I'm not explaining it very well, and most of you probably reading this probably think I'm crazy, but I can only describe how I felt at that moment. I briefly thought about calling the police, but I had no idea what I would even say if I did. Making small talk with a neighbor is hardly a crime, and if anyone acted suspiciously, it was me. Threatening to assault a stranger didn't sound like a sane reaction to the situation. I chose to keep my mouth shut and say nothing, and that includes to my wife. There was no way she'd even understand, and I don't really blame her. After that incident, I began carrying my handgun with me in the evenings and changed the route that I took. Fortunately, I would never have another experience like that again, but I would see that man one more time. It had been 5 or 6 months since he and I had spoken. I was doing a good job putting the incident behind me. One afternoon, my wife and I were unloading groceries from the car, and a silver 4-door sedan slowly drove by. The driver waved at us, and being the friendly neighbor that I usually am, I waved back. I barely lowered my hand when I realized that the driver was that same stranger. All those awful feelings came flooding back. That horrible smile burned into my mind, and I'm not sure how long I was really standing there, and my wife's voice pulled me back to earth. She asked if I was okay and said that I was white as a sheet. Rather than dredge up the whole story and risk looking like some insane person, I told her that I was probably just dehydrated. She accepted the excuse, and we went back to unloading the car. 5 years have gone by, and I haven't seen this guy since. Even though I've had all this time to think about it, I still have no idea why he and I crossed paths that day. He obviously sought me out, but that's all I can be certain of. I've had some minor disagreements with a few neighbors, but nothing that I could think justified hiring someone to intimidate or even stalk me. He never gave me a message or threatened me like you'd think a person like that would. Unless he shows up again or someone brings it up, I can only conclude that he chose me at random to just bully. And now that I've finally told people about what happened, I intend to make this the last time that I talk about it. Hopefully, sharing it here will allow me to let it go once and for all, and it can be forgotten about forever.
Our official merch store is finally here. If you want to support more of our channel, check out our merch shop. The link is in the description down below. See you on the next video.